Parmigiano Reggiano, or Parmesan cheese, as it is known in English, is an Italian dairy product renowned throughout the world and is a crucial multi-billion-dollar agricultural industry based in the Po River Valley south of Milan, on the edge of the Apennine Mountains. And it is in those mountains where the Gothic Line offensive took place more than 80 years ago in World War II. What is not so well known is that 60% or more of the workforce that keeps the Italian Parmesan cheese production alive are immigrants who came in the past 30 years from India, almost all of them of the Sikh religious faith. Further south in Italy, not far from where Allied forces waged the Gustav Line part of World War II, Indians also help keep alive another Italian delicacy, this one known as mozzarella di bufalo cheese. In Italy, as in many other parts of Europe, this immigrant workforce underpins the economy, whether it be in the agricultural, manufacturing, construction, tourist, or other service sectors. Yet, their outsized role in modern Italy is as underappreciated as are the forebears of these immigrants who helped free Italy and Europe from Nazi and Italian fascist tyranny some 80 years ago. Moreover, immigrants, past and present, are not part of the glamorous post-World War II dolce vita narrative of Italy that defined the country for so many decades. And that brings us to the politically misunderstood, manipulated, and divisive issue of immigration that plagues Europe today. And it is the subject for today's Past is Present component of the podcast, where we highlight the parallels and links to what happened 80 years ago in Italy on the Gothic Line in World War II and the current geo-economic and political events of the day. So not only does immigration divide nations in Europe, but it also splits like-minded political groups, and that has especially become the case in the past year, as some centrist and center-left politicians have jumped on the anti-immigrant bandwagon. Of course, they are jumping on the bandwagon led by far-right extremists, such as the United Kingdom's Nigel Farage, France's Marine Le Pen, or emerging extreme political parties such as the Alternative for Deutschland, or AfD, in Germany. That bandwagon also includes Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and her coalition partner, Matteo Salvini. We have been reminded of that of late by their recent proposal to pay immigrant lawyers a bonus if they convince their immigrant clients to leave Italy instead of pursuing Italian citizenship. Of course, the anti-immigrant bandwagon's number one cheerleader these days is U.S. President Donald Trump. Under his direction, American immigration enforcement has overwhelmingly targeted persons of color and have engaged in unconstitutional Gestapo-like tactics, including shooting in cold blood American citizens who protest his policies. At the same time, he is also trying to extort European countries to follow similar xenophobic measures. But just as immigration is a divisive political issue, it is in Europe also a huge economic conundrum. That is especially the case now as European countries must dramatically expand defense spending to deal with security threats from Russia, or to deal with the economic impact of Trump's tariffs, or his war in Iran, or his threats to pull out of NATO, or even to take over Greenland, whether it be by hook or crook. Clearly, maintaining the revered European cradle to grave social model and dealing with added budget costs and economic restraints means only one thing. The continent desperately needs significant higher economic growth than it has been able to muster over recent decades. And as any independent economist will confirm, immigration can and should be a dividend that helps Europe generate this much needed economic growth. The fact is, today there is very pertinent empirical evidence of this on the European continent. That happens to be in Spain, where the current government has rejected the anti immigrant scapegoat dogma and has simultaneously generated the highest economic growth in Europe. Aside from the obvious racism that drives much of the anti immigrant debate in contemporary politics, there is also historical ignorance at play. And that brings us to a relevant chapter in European history that we have highlighted throughout numerous episodes of this podcast. And that is the role of persons of color, not only from India, but other countries, played in freeing continental Europe from Nazi and fascist tyranny in World War II. In fact, the blood of African Americans, Brazilians, Black South Africans, Japanese Americans, and others was spilt on European soil, especially on the Gothic Line, between 1944 and 1945. To help me unpack these past and present issues, I have two guests joining me today. First is Mirko Zanoni, who is the director of the Alcides Cervi Institute, which is based in the Po River Valley and was launched in honor of Alcide Cervi and his 7 sons, who were executed by Italian fascists because of their activities to liberate Italy from Benito Mussolini's brutal dictatorship in the early 1940s. The Alcide Cervi Institute also has, over the last 5 decades, worked to promote social equity, especially in the agricultural sector, and to help integrate immigrant families. It is also happens to be located in the heart of the region of Romagna, where the Parmesan cheese is produced and which is so dependent on the Sikh community. Secondly, we have Federico Fubini, who is a vice director of the leading Italian newspaper Il Corriere della Sera, and he is one of the paper's chief economic correspondents. He also regularly provides expert economic and political commentary on Italian television news broadcasts and talk shows. Fubini also is acutely aware of the complex and tragic story of World War II in Italy, as some of his family members were either exiled, imprisoned, or killed because of their Jewish heritage. I'm sitting here in the Cervi Museum with Mirko Zanoni, and he is the director of the museum. In our conversation today, we're going to talk about the issue of immigration and how it's played a role in Italy's past, and also how it plays a role in Italy's present. So, Mirko, in my conversations with Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis who live and work in Italy today, and who have learned about the role of the forebears and what they did in liberating Italy from the Nazi Germans and the Italian fascists, many believe their ancestors' help is not recognized nor is it appreciated. Do you agree with that? What is your feeling about that?
I strongly agree. Absolutely. Yes. The widespread narrative public memory and the majority of the historiography have the perception of a very simplified liberation. There are the liberators, generically allies, seen in two-dimensional ways, with very little in-depth analysis about the Allied forces. And then there are us, the Italians, who freed themselves through the work of the military and civil resistance. This is the whole story. We have always invested heavily in the past in this last aspect, the resistance of the Italians to the detriment of the multinational and multicultural complexity of the war that has passed on our communities. Even more seriously, we have no idea of the kind of memory that survives today in the Pakistani and Bangladesh and Indian communities of that lived history. I believe that there is a total disconnect between the two historical process, the war of liberation and the broad phenomenon of stable immigration in our country, both in our society and in our institutions.
So, soldiers of color from not only India, but from other parts of Asia, Africa, South America, and the United States, they fought and died for democracy in Italy, even though they did not have it in their own country. So, is that a history lesson that should be taught in every high school and university classes?
The variety of our school classes today, the multi-ethnic composition and the ease with which today children and the young people assimilate this plurality was a special opportunity to tell the story of the Second World War for multiple points of view. Immigrant families today are bearers of history, such as the Second World War. There is no trace of all of this in our history manuals. No trace of all levels, except for courageous incursions by enlightened teachers who, or schools would, in their autonomy, intertwine teaching activity with local association of immigrants. There is the chapter of war. Then there is the chapter in our history books of others, the colonization, the conflicts of the second half of the 20th century, etc. But they are separate parts of the program in history. Even more seriously, the very story of Italian fascism could be told starting from the criminal and racist conduct of colonial conquest and broaden the opportunities to the many foreign communities present in Italy today. As with the Indians and the others, what do we know about the war memories of Maghreb, East Africa, etc.? The answer is very little or nothing. We know nothing on this part of the history. Even if they are our neighbors, even if they are now permanently included in our economic process, we know nothing of this.
So, most independent economists insist that the political debate today about immigration in Italy and other parts of Europe does not seem to be based on facts. The most important of those facts is the role that immigrants play in supporting the economy, especially in the service and tourist sector, which is especially true here in Italy. The second fact is that in the face of an aging population and the need for economic growth to finance social welfare and especially now defense programs, immigration is vital. So, do you agree with that? And how is that addressed in Italy?
Well, we have a particular point of view from Casa Cervi. It's a place of education, training, and dialogue. A place of the countryside always marries with the ideas of freedom and hospitality. As in the months of the resistance, the picture is black. We always say, starting from the observation of our schools, society and reality are already much more complex and integrated than the political and culturally debate in Italy shows. The perception of immigration is totally distorted to a constant work of a racist subculture that has lasted for at least 30 years, in line with many other countries in Europe. It is a paradox, but in a country like Italy, in which the concrete, the numerical incidence of immigrants is not comparable that of many other European states, constantly has migration as a perennial emergency at the center of public discourse, so much so that it shaped the parliament, the public institution. It's a cultural battle that has perhaps lost a long time ago. For a long time, the debate on migration, the history of the mobility of the peoples has escaped factual data. Only a process of collective denial can explain it. Demographic reasons, economic reasons. Even before arriving at values and morality, it is the cold data that show it. And there is the whole story of Europe, so small and yet so popular. We struggle to recognize that many Europeans that have followed one another from ancient times onwards have had their strengths precisely in immigration has always been the resource to our civilization. Each of us is here because somewhere in time our ancestors wanted to move precisely to this place.
So sadly, far right political parties in Italy, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom and other European countries have scapegoated immigrants and use fear mongering tactics that have distorted the immigration debate, as you alluded to earlier. So, how much does racism play a role in these tactics?
We always say to the adults, to the parents, look at your classes, your children's classes. They are not battlefields. They are not frontiers of ethnic replacement. They are not trenches of religious and cultural conflict. They are workshops that face reality. And then when they leave school, they not find the debate between the adults worthy of their legitimate questions. The truth is the prejudice and the social resentment, fear and uncertainty are strategic assets for an entire family of political forces. All this doesn't even need to become a declared racism. Very few right wing and ultra right voters wouldn't admit to being racist. But the demonization of diversity is a cheap investment. It costs very little. And it is even more convenient to continue not to solve the problem. Let it continue to be perceived and experience it as a problem. For those who profit from the fear of immigration, there is no interest in improving the situation, which they denunciate and amplify with great animosity. They would lose a fundamental source of consensus. And therefore, more and more often in Italy and elsewhere, a ruling class governs that does not want to solve the problem that sent it to the power. I fear it's a situation destined to explode sooner or later.
So, considering the contribution immigrants have made to Italy 80 years ago and in recent decades, is it an injustice that they have to wait a minimum of 10 years and quite often longer than that to become a citizen of Italy? And if so, do you think the law should be changed about this?
In Italy, we have recently had an important referendum on the waiting times to obtain citizenship. The results were disastrous. Not only did the very few voters show up at the polls, also to vote on another questions that had to do with the world of work and other similar issues. But the one on accelerated citizenship is the one that went worse, even in an electoral body that was perceived as sensitive to reception issues. When I say that the anti-immigration subculture has come under the skin of many Italians, I mean precisely this. A long generational journey is needed to reverse a trend in which the same political and social forces sensitive to the issue of immigration and multicultural society, the left, have been playing away from home for decades.
A little more than 12 years ago, the Sikh community organized a fundraising campaign to have a life size statue for the Indian soldier cemetery in Forli. And that statue portrays two Sikh soldiers assisting a wounded Italian soldier from the co belligerent army that joined the Allied forces in late 1944 and 45. And very few people know about that statue. So, do you think that statue should be a symbol of a strong, integrated, democratic Italian society and should be recognized by the government as an historic landmark?
Oh, I think so, I hope I'm wrong, but I believe that very few know about this work, and about the efforts of the Sikh community, which is also numerous and very visible in our land, to tell their presence and their story. Perception of the crucial role of the Indian troops following their allies is very low, as we're saying, even more than their sacrifice. If anything, it has left a strong mark on communities where this action has left tangible marks, objects and memorabilia, experiences linked to individual family memories, as along the Battle of Senio in Alfonsina in Romagna and in Forlì. This happened due to the permanence of the front, and the population were in contact with the troops for a long and difficult month, creating bridges from people and stories. The foreign cemeteries along the Gothic line are very little known and visited, although they are an extraordinary memorial resource, even in architecture. I would like to point out the Brazilian cemetery in the hills of Pistoia, for example, in addition to the one already indicated at Forlì. I believe that many Italians learned the presence of the Indians in the liberation troops from the film The English Patient, where one of the protagonists is a bomb disposal expert with a turban. Another controversial example, again to remain in the cinematographic field, was the example of Miracle at Sant'Anna by Spike Lee, where one of the most serious Nazi fascist massacres in Italy is actually tell the story of the epic 92 Buffalo's division soldiers, entirely made up of black soldiers. I believe we expect great waving work from historians and teachers to tie our communities: Emilian, Sikh, Pakistani, Christian, Hindu, Muslim, etc. The Second World War is not a metaphor, is a great human story, which, through the tragedy of the conflict, has inextricably linked to the destinies of distant and now once again close peoples. We just have to keep reminding ourselves and continuing teaching it.
Mirko, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today here at the Cherview Museum. The museum itself is a great historic memory and landmark, and just like the cemeteries and other sites on the Gothic line, this is a must see to understand the past and to deal with the problems of today.
Thank you.
That was Mirko Zanoni, who is the director of the Cervi Institute and Museum, located in the heart of the Italian Po River Valley, which is the most important breadbasket in Italy. And the Institute, through its educational and research programs, its workshops, and agricultural outreach field operations, is at the forefront of efforts in Italy to integrate immigrants into the Italian economy and community. Now we're going to turn to Federico Fubini, who, as I mentioned earlier, is a vice director at leading Italian newspaper Il Corriere della Sera, and who is a prominent economic and political commentator at not only the newspaper, but also on TV and radio broadcasts in Italy. So, Federico, first question: is Europe in general facing a major political crisis when it comes to its social model, the sacred covenant of the post-World War II years, which includes cradle-to-grave healthcare, generous vacations, free university education, and other benefits, because of the need to significantly boost defense spending? So how does this dilemma play out over the coming years politically?
Look, Joe, I don't think this is such a stark alternative, provided, and this is a big if, provided there is economic growth. If there is economic growth, there is no reason to think that European countries will not be able to fund a modernized welfare state, would not be able to fund a modernized education sector or healthcare sector. There are certainly savings to find in those sectors without weakening the supply of services. But of course, the big if is about economic growth, because you do have important headwinds. If you think that roughly 2/3 of GDP in each and every of our countries comes from household consumption, and you see declining populations just about everywhere. Certainly, Italy was early in this process, but I think Italy has already lost a couple of million residents over the last 10 years. It's losing about 200,000 residents for demographic and migration reasons every year. And it's projected to be down from somewhere around 60 million a few years ago down to 35 million at the end of the century. And if you think that household consumption provides 2/3 of essentially GDP, so how do you make sure that consumption is not structurally in recession in such a situation, given a widespread preference for not opening up so much to migration? So this is a big question mark. So I think the real question is not so much what do we do about defense spending, because defense spending can have even very positive spin-offs in technology, for industry, employment, education, labor skills. I'm not that much concerned about that. I mean, I don't think you could make a reasonable argument to say that defense spending subtracted to US economic growth, rather the opposite, right? What I'm worried about is the demographic factor, because that could be a sentence to degrowth for eternity for European countries, namely the most demographically challenged European countries. Italy is one of them, Germany as well, if a bit less. And so that calls for two big steps. I mean, in our society, I think what we need is increase, economists call it productivity, but essentially the effectiveness and the value creation when we spend time working. So we need to be much more efficient in what we do at every level, frankly, more hourly productivity, labor productivity, total factor productivity. I mean, there are many different definitions, but unless we do that, I don't see how we get out of this dilemma. It's the productivity demographics problem rather than the defense spending per se.
And of course, as you mentioned, that touches on the issue of migration. That is actually one of the reasons that drove me to do this podcast is when I went around parts of Italy, especially on the Gothic line, and saw how there's so many persons from Asia, from Africa, persons of color who fought and died on the Gothic line, and their descendants are the immigrants of today working in Italy in restaurants, hotels, construction sites that basically keep the service economy going. Yet there's double standards when it comes to Italian citizenship rules, etc. It seems the current government hasn't really come to grips in Italy and other parts of Europe, as well as the United States, on the dividend of immigration when it comes to Western liberal democracy.
Well, I would say first, there is no silver bullet here, because on one level, one has to be very understanding of the common people's concerns. When you saw all those boats reaching your shores and you wake up in the morning and you live in a coastal city and you see essentially boats coming from nobody knows where, and you feel that your borders are being violated by people you don't know, and you don't know the whether they are bringing in viruses or anything like that. That creates a serious insecurity. And so, although I'm with you about migration in many respects, so I could make you a perfect argument why we need migrants, and we would need to have much better legal economic migration policy in this country and other European countries. I'm all for it. Don't misunderstand me. But you also take people's concerns seriously, because it's not just politicians trying to whip up public anger. there are serious concerns. I mean, the idea of the security of the place where you live is something very deep ingrained into human minds. And on one level, voters need to know that people in government are taking care of their security. At the same time, there is no way around it. We need a much better legal migration policy. And that comes even from society as a demand. What we see employers' confederations or employers associations investing in, schooling potential migrants in their own countries. In several African countries are vocational schools that have been set up by essentially business associations from several northern Italian towns, because they know that if they school those people there, then they can bring them to Italy without them having to go through the complex and very bureaucratic and malfunctioning quota system. So there is a real need, but the response is not coming from central government, it's not even coming from regional governments. It is coming directly from society, that is business associations, trade associations, and so on and so forth. So it's something that politics is not managing, but society is starting to try to get a hand on.
On that hopeful note, we will end this third of 3 episodes about the Indian soldiers' story on the Gothic Line and their immigrant descendants. And I would again like to thank my guests today, Mirko Zanoni of the Cervi Institute and Museum, as well as Federico Fubini, who is the vice director of leading Italian newspaper Il Corriere della Sera and a prominent economic and political commentator with the newspaper, as well as with major Italian TV and radio broadcast. And I would like to remind our listeners to check out the first 2 episodes of the Indian Soldier series if they have not done so. Both provide a look back at the contribution of 50,000 Indian soldiers who fought and died in Italy to defeat Nazism and Italian fascism, and how their descendants, who were totally unaware before they arrived in Italy, have commemorated their forebears' sacrifice with great dignity.